When I visited Arizona in the United States a few years ago, I was immediately shocked by two things. First, I was one of the very few people walking in the street and not using a car. And second, I had to carry a jacket with me everywhere I went, even when it was 38 degrees Celsius outside. Why did I need the jacket? Well, despite being so warm outside, most of the buildings were air conditioned to freezing point, something which I'm sure you're all familiar with to some degree. But the contrast in Arizona was one that I've never experienced before. I can recall one building in particular where I even noticed that some of the workers had heaters set on full blast under their desk to keep themselves warm as they tapped away at their keyboards, despite it being sweltering outside. As an observer, I was bemused by the situation. Hot weather outside, an air conditioning system indoors to cool you down, but so much so that you needed to use a heater on a maximum setting to warm you back up. How much energy was being unnecessarily wasted here? You may or may not be surprised that the major areas of energy consumption in buildings are heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, accounting for 35% of total building energy use, lighting, 11%, major appliances, 18%, with the remaining 36% in miscellaneous areas, including electronics. Most of us are already familiar with the impact of cars on CO2 emissions, but how many of us are aware of exactly how our seemingly innocent conscious actions as building occupants, from our homes to the office, the under-desk heater at full blast being a case in point, are unconsciously damaging our environment? While there is an expectation that our buildings should be designed in a way to minimize energy consumption, the key factors that influence these consumptions are far more complex than we realize and make us accountable, especially when one of these is the human factor, a term used to describe how humans interact with a particular environment under different conditions. Buildings are often thought of or described in a physical, aesthetic, and emotional sense. How do they look? How does the space within the building makes you feel? But how often do you hear someone say, this building is an architectural marvel, I wonder how much energy it consumes, or I just feel so connected with this building, I wonder how much CO2 it emits? Well, here are some facts that may interest you. Buildings consume around 1/3 of the total primary energy resources. Building energy consumption accounts for 30% of the global CO2 emission. Human behavior, and by this I mean the good kind of behavior, can potentially save up to 80% of a building's energy consumption. Now that we know that modifying human behavior can have such a positive impact on energy consumption, how do we, as a society and individually, work towards this saving of 80%? I'd like to focus your attention on these women walking across the desert so elegantly in their colorful saris carrying water pots. They are screened from the sun by their light clothing, permeable to the wind. They have a fairly open posture, which maximizes the evaporation from their bodies, cooling it down. And water pots that they are carrying also offer an extra shield from the sun and some evaporative cooling. This is an example of adaptive behavior, a behavior that refers to when a person is able to successfully endure their environment through modifying their behavior. Deployed by our early ancestors to deal with habitat change and environmental diversity, it has been our strongest weapon to survive the harshest climatic conditions for millions of years. While walking across a hot desert with the sun beating down on us may not be an everyday pursuit for most of us, from making a conscious choice in the selection of our clothing to how much we move in our home and work environment, there are plenty of adaptive behaviors that we can adopt to achieve comfort in the environments that we inhabit. Alongside adaptive behavior, tapping into behavioral neuroscience may also offer a solution in conserving the energy of buildings. reminding us that the greater motivator to behavioral change is pleasure more than fear. In architect Lisa Hession's book, Thermal Delight in Architecture, she reminds us of the potential of using thermal qualities as an expressive element in building design and inspires us to consider a new dimension to the architectural experience. She argues that for many years, building technology and design has favored methods of high energy consumption to neutralize the thermal environment, which has compromised our thermal coping and sensing mechanisms. The various ways that people use, remember, and care about the thermal environment and how they associate the thermal sense with their other senses, like visual, acoustic, olfactory, and tactile, has been somewhat deprioritized and replaced with central heating system and air conditioning and hermetically sealed buildings providing a thermally monotonous experience. For example, think about how coming home after a walk in the cold to an open fire might spark feelings of joy, even if the air temperature of the space is much lower than what you might experience in coming back to, say, an overly heated office. The visual stimuli and evocative power of the open fire, and not your computer screen, as well as the acclimatization from being outdoors, enhances our thermal experience, which can increase our feelings of comfort and even improve our mood. Theories in thermal comfort science have also revealed that what regulates our thermal experience is not just a single core thermal receptor, as previously thought, but a multitude of thermal receptors found in our skin. So if we harness this new knowledge in the way that we think about comfort, the way we choose to seek comfort, and the way we design for comfort, we are more likely to find opportunities for adaptation and energy savings, like enhancing natural ventilation and relaxing the dress code in an office as alternatives to cranking up the air conditioning. Of course, we mustn't forget the more practical, basic ways to reduce energy consumption that everyone can get involved in. Sometimes it can be difficult to know where to start in trying to address issues such as climate change, as the topic can seem so vast. It can be difficult to visualize how our small-scale efforts will contribute towards rectifying these large-scale global issues, especially if there is no definitive visible end goal in sight. The solution here is just to start. Simple, everyday energy-saving techniques in the long run can make all the difference. With the help of smart metering and the Internet of Things, this will become increasingly easier to implement. While climate change and energy consumption are topics that are often reported in the media with a plethora of high-profile figures advocating how our attitudes in climate change have to change, many studies have shown that beyond the use of transport, energy consumption, and hence CO2 emissions, and our contributions towards it is poorly understood amongst the general public. So how do we make people more aware of the implications of energy use in buildings? And what can we do to change this? How do we make this discussion mainstream? And this is a challenge because, let's face it, the topic of energy consumption in relation to building isn't sexy. Well, we create a movement. Currently, we are not harnessing the collective social and political will to change in the right way, and we are losing our battle to achieve a better future for subsequent generations. We need to make people more aware of how their behavior impacts the environment. We need to spotlight the simple, relatively effortless measures I've already mentioned in a way which is unequivocal, achievable, and quantifiable, and encourage people to adapt their behavior to do their part in reducing global energy consumption. We need to drive people to take action today. In recent months, we have unwillingly signed up to the biggest global experiment of our time. That may have restricted our movement, yet has clearly demonstrated the power of our inadvertent collective efforts in making the air cleaner in our cities and the water clearer in our harbors and canals. We have given back to nature because our choices have been restricted through the forces of nature. Yet, the challenging experience of the pandemic has taught us as a very valuable lesson that the possibility for change and a better environment is there if we want it. The challenge is how do we go about engaging people and sustaining interest, which is no mean feat. So how about if we brought the focus back to how the movement benefits us? In recent years, health and well-being has gradually moved up to the top of the environmental design and sustainable agenda for buildings. Environmental design building experts have evolved from documenting sick building syndrome, which is experienced when people complain of symptoms associated with acute discomfort, such as headaches, eye, nose, and throat irritation, or fatigue, for example, that are related to an experience in a specific building, to developing new building standards which focus on the health and well-being of occupants and give specific guidelines on the way to design healthier buildings. These buildings are also defined as those that require a minimal amount of energy to run and are based on natural and climate-responsive strategies to maximize daylight, to ventilate, cool, and keep warm with solar energy. These are the buildings where occupants are encouraged to adopt adaptive behavior and feel motivated to do so, knowing that the building will have a positive impact on their health and well-being. These are the building of our future. The future we want to build requires a positive vision of our world. Inspiring the collective imagination with this positive outlook can be a valuable strategy to motivate people towards energy and environmentally responsive behavior. Not because it is a chore, but because we know it's good for us. It makes us healthy and happy. Paul Allen, an environmental expert and professional speaker who has devoted his career to the education of building professionals, planners, and policymakers on finding solutions for climate change, promotes a zero carbon vision for Britain, which is based on a positive outlook of the future rather than the dystopian and apocalyptic narrative which has dominated much of the last 40 years. When it comes to climate change, the media often peddles notion of the guilt and shame we should feel at what we have done to our planet, accompanied by images of melting glaciers and ice caps and compromised wildlife, with constant reminders of the imminent catastrophe that lies ahead within a fragmented and divided political scene. But it doesn't have to be this way. As a society, we need to adopt the already existing alternative frameworks for the decarbonization of transport, food, energy, buildings, and land use, and approach climate change with optimism and hope. Originally derived from the Greek word architekton, meaning chief creator, the verb architettare in Italian, which doesn't translate directly in English, means to conceive and mastermind, envision, predict, and realize the end result. We are all capable of becoming the chief architects of our future, knowing that we can influence the immediate environment around us on a global scale. The way we use our buildings and interact with our environment has the potential to be much more efficient, powerful, and meaningful than any other design object in any other time in history. With seemingly small decisions that we make as occupants of those buildings, from our homes to our offices, can make a substantial difference in the energy consumption of a building and hence our environment, as evidenced by those raging under the desk heaters in Arizona. We all share the responsibility for reducing emissions from the buildings that we occupy and for improving the environment and its performance. As we move towards the increasingly interactive use and complex co-production of buildings, we become architects of our immediate environment. It is a simultaneous multiple ripple effect leading to something greater, better, and more powerful. The British architect Norman Foster once said, "As an architect, you design for the present with an awareness of the past for a future which is essentially unknown." I now say, let's not let our future be unknown, because we can all be environmental architects of our future.